All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this early hour. We're going to get started here in five, four, three, two, one.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third GOP debate breakdown webinar. I'm here with Dr. Richard Salzman, Senior Scholar at the Atlas Society, Professor of Political Economy at Duke. We did one of these breakdowns for the second GOP debate. If you want to check that out, it is up on the Atlas Society's YouTube. So we are here to talk about last night's debate. We're going to play some clips, get some reactions, get an objectivist perspective on these candidates and their answers to the big important questions that they were asked by our NBC moderators, if we can call them that. So Richard, if you want to jump in and start here with, you were going to give a little talk about how to evaluate these candidates.
Yeah, I just did want to say a few words. I did this last time, but you may not have seen the last time we did this debate, Abby and I, analyzing the debate. The first overview I want to say is, first of all, this was much better than the first or second debate, possibly mostly because there were only 5 on the stage, not 55 or whatever the first one was. The second, even though it was done by NBC, I thought the questions were actually pretty substantive, serious, and short. So the moderators and the questioners were not trying to hijack the thing with their own agenda. So that was good. And I thought the candidates were, for the most part, very good. I think DeSantis shined. I think DeSantis is really the best of all. And maybe Nikki Haley second and Ramaswamy last. I think Senator Scott was absolutely the worst. So that's just as an overview. But I want to say, in terms of judging, less than ideal candidates, and ideal here, I don't mean platonic ideal. I mean, it's okay for us to have a standard in advance of what the ideal political system is, therefore the ideal political parties, therefore the ideal political candidates. But if you're dismissive because they're so far away of all those things and then just become overly critical, that's not really very valuable. So my standard has always been, how close do they come to adhering to our views, especially on matters of politics? Now, one of the reasons I kind of dismiss Senator Scott, is he's kind of an evangelist. He's just talking about religion and faith and things like that. But when it comes to the presidency, the most important thing is foreign policy, because he is the commander in chief. The second most important thing is the economy. And so there were questions on this, obviously. But the idea is not that they meet our ideal standard, but who is closest to it. And then secondly, that I've identified before, you do have to look at who can practically become president and be good at it. And in that regard, governors tend to be better presidents, say, than senators or business people. And in that regard, there were 3 governors on the stage, but only one existing, acting, and very successful governor, which is DeSantis. So a couple of things like that I just wanted to mention ahead of time. The way of judging and then looking at the biography of these people, how likely they are to be a decent president.
Yeah, and that was interesting you said DeSantis, because I wrote down in my highlights that he was repeatedly able to point to his track record in Florida on multiple questions, which really none of the other candidates were able to do. In fact, I think sometimes Nikki Haley's track record doesn't look so good for her, her background in the UN and things. So I think DeSantis really shined there, obviously more than the other candidates, but especially
right. I also want to I agree with you, Abby, and I also want to add that I'm a unrepentant, like unrestructured Republican. So just for those who know I'm analyzing, I am pro-Republican. So I almost always prefer the Republican candidate, no matter how flawed, to the Democrat. But now within that, though, I'm very skeptical about Republicans who start by trashing each other instead of going after, especially in the presidential, where that the ultimate foe will be the other Democrat presidential candidate. Ronald Reagan famously invoked what he used to call the 11th commandment, which was thou shall not speak ill of other Republicans. Now, he didn't always refrain from doing that, but you got to make sure the target is correct. And in that regard, Trump is really bad because he trashes other Republicans all the time, and it just hurts you in the general election. So that's another way of gauging the people on the stage.
Yeah, and as a young person, I've been very I'm kind of lean less towards the neocon, old conservative right. And I've really liked Vivek Ramaswamy in the past. I think it almost seemed to me as if he was really doubling down on the Trump playbook to attack Nikki Haley, to attack Ron DeSantis. I almost wondered if him and Trump have been in, he's obviously not going to win. I almost wonder if he's here kind of on behalf of to attack these candidates. That's obviously a conspiracy, but I didn't find that it served him as well this time as in previous debates. So
I agree, and largely because he started Ramaswamy started by attacking the media, then attacking the RNC head. It's not that those two aren't worth attacking, but it took away his message of what is your positive message of what you're doing. But since I named foreign policy and military policy as a top priority of judging a president, and the fact that there's conflicts going on in the world, you could classify these five. I would classify the five the following way. The ones who are most neocon, hawkish, interventionist, and I think to a degree harmful to American national self-interest are Haley, Christie, and Scott. Now they're on the margins, so they're not not leading in the polls. Ramaswamy is the least interventionist, and DeSantis is somewhat in between. But DeSantis and Ramaswamy, I think, are best on this. And what's interesting is they largely mirror the Trump view. The Trump view, remember, was in 2016, he was criticizing Jeb Bush and the Bush family for Iraq. So Trump was willing to question both parties on engaging in forever wars that weren't being won. And that, of course, was the case in Iraq. It was the case in Afghanistan. So Ramaswamy and DeSantis are onto something by saying, listen, if you want to promote American national self-interest, it doesn't mean we should make the world safe for democracy or invade or help other countries. Ramaswamy was very strong on saying Ukraine was a kind of autocracy, not a democracy. I think that's true. But notice Nikki Haley said, no, they were freedom-loving, pro-American democracy. So big differences there.
yes, definitely. And speaking of differences, that's kind of how the debate started. I was actually impressed how NBC started this debate with the big question, which is
Yes.
what differentiates you from President Trump. So
It was a very good start. Yes.
yeah, so Lawrence, our man behind the camera, will be pulling up some clips for us here. And I wanted to start with that very first question, and then Ron DeSantis as our PAC leader. I think it's worth noting that he's still well below Trump in the polls,
Yeah.
but he's still leading among other candidates in most polls. So Lawrence, if you want to cue up our first clip, we can hear Ron DeSantis's take on why he's better than Trump.
First ex-president in more than 100 years to run for the White House again. And he remains popular among Republican primary voters as his legal challenges mount. Governor DeSantis, let me begin with you on this one. Speak to Republican voters who are supporting Donald Trump. Why should you and not him be the Republican nominee to face Joe Biden a year from now?
This country is in trouble, and the elites that have put us here, they don't care about you. They don't care that you're having to grapple with higher grocery prices or have higher gas prices. They don't care that your family's less secure because of the open border that's allowed drugs and even terrorists to come into this country. Well, I care. I am not going to sit idly by and let this country continue its downward spiral. We need leadership, and we need it now. I'll take the hits, I'll take the arrows, I'll take the slings, because ultimately it's not about me. It's about you. I will fight for you. I will make sure to lead this country's revival, and I will win for you and your family. Actions speak louder than words. We don't have time for excuses, and it's not something that we're going to be able to have all these distractions. As a veteran, I will get the job done. Now, if you look where we are now, it's a lot different than we were in 2016. And Donald Trump's a lot different guy than he was in 2016. He owes it to you to be on this stage and explain why he should get another chance. He should explain why he didn't have Mexico pay for the border wall. He should explain why he racked up so much debt. He should explain why he didn't drain the swamp. And he said Republicans were going to get tired of winning. Well, we saw last night, I'm sick of Republicans losing. In Florida, I showed how it's done. 1 year ago here, we won a historic victory, including a massive landslide right here in Miami-Dade County. That's how we have to do it. So I promise you this, as the nominee, next November, I'll get the job done. And as president, I will deliver.
Your time is up. Let me turn to investment.
Yeah, so I thought that was a pretty strong start for Ron DeSantis. I think he's only gotten better as the debates have gone on.
Yeah, it was a good start. And this is a perfect example of how you indirectly differentiate yourself and criticize the leading candidate without naming him. Now, he did name Trump, but it wasn't name calling. And notice the issue of it's not about me. Implication, it's all about Trump. Every time Trump talks, it's about me, and I lost the election and I'm going to revenge. Distractions, said, I'm not going to be distracted. What is he referring to? All the legal cases, Trump in court. Later in the debate, he referred to this guy's going to spend 18 months, in and out of court over the next, even if he wins the elections. So and naming a couple of policy failures on the border. I'm surprised he didn't mention COVID because you could criticize Trump for empowering and enabling Fauci, Birx, and others. And DeSantis was so good on COVID in Florida. That's another way for him to differentiate himself. But again, all he has to do is positively say, I wasn't for lockdowns. I wasn't for shutting down the economy. I wasn't, for violating the civil liberties of people who didn't want to take vaccines. He has gone there before. It's not like he has forgotten this, but he could have thrown that in as well. So I did think it was a good opening, not overly complicated, and definitely not violating the 11th commandment about trashing other Republicans.
Yeah, and
of course, all of these guys need the Trump supporters, so they have to be delicate about this to begin with. Yeah,
right. It was interesting though how COVID really didn't come up. I mean, It was almost like there was like a ban on COVID, and I don't know why that was, but it really didn't come up a lot. So,
and I would say, Abby, on COVID, it's always a good idea not to look backwards, but look forward, and not relitigate old controversies. But in this case, the way to pitch it is, one, I was right when a lot of people were telling me to do otherwise. This would be the DeSantis message, but not just that. This could happen again. Viruses come out all the time. And so the reason you have to be on record here is it's perfectly possible. And if you look at the healthcare community that might want to promote this, the CDC, the WHO, and others, it could happen again. It might well happen again. So you don't want the same bad policy. So it is worth bringing up because it could happen again.
Yeah. And then, we talked about racking up debt. I found that interesting because that's something I didn't really track in Trump's presidency.
Right.
Nikki Haley mentions it as well. He racked up, I think she said $8 trillion.
7 or 8 trillion. Yeah. So, out of the 34 we have, 7 or 8 trillion of it just in 4 years. That's a lot. Yeah, some of it attributed it to the wars, which is true, but all of it. But also remember, Trump, when he ran in 2016, as some of them are running today, said, "I'm not going to touch entitlements. I'm not going to touch the welfare state. I'm not going to touch Social Security or Medicare." Well, that runs up the deficit as well in huge amounts.
Okay, I was wondering where that came from. I didn't know, if a majority of that came at the end of his presidency too with COVID, or
Yes. Answer yes. The second part, the second half, the last 2 years, most of it. Yeah.
Right. Which, excuse me, kind of makes him, I don't know. At that time, he was just taking cues from Fauci. He was taking cues from whatever that other lady was, which he could be criticized for. So, well, then, we had Vivek Ramaswamy. He responds. This is where he comes on really strong. And I think it's worth kind of showing how he starts here. Maybe if you want to cue up that, Lawrence, because he comes really hard at NBC. He says Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, they should moderate these debates. So I don't know if we want to play that real quick before we jump on to foreign policy. So they went next.
Why should you be the nominee and not the former president?
I think there's something deeper going on in the Republican Party here, and I am upset about what happened last night. We've become a party of losers at the end of the day. It was a cancer to the Republican establishment. Let's speak the truth. I mean, since Ronna McDaniel took over as chairwoman of the RNC in 2017, we have lost 2018, 2020, 2022, no red wave that never came. We got trounced last night in 2023. And I think that we have to have accountability in our party. For that matter, Ron, if you want to come on stage tonight, you want to look the GOP voters in the eye and tell them you resign, I will yield my time to you. And frankly, look, the people there are cheering for losing in the Republican Party. Think about who's moderating this debate. This should be Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, and Elon Musk. We'd have 10 times the viewership, asking questions that GOP primary voters actually care about and bringing more people into our party. Do you think the Democrats, and we've got Kristen Welker here, do you think the Democrats would actually hire Greg Gutfeld to host a Democratic debate? They wouldn't do it. And so the fact of the matter is, Kristen, I'm going to use this time because this is actually about you in the media and the corrupt media establishment. Ask you, the Trump-Russia collusion hoax that you pushed on this network for years, was that real or was that Hillary Clinton made up disinformation? Answer the question. Go.
Mr. Roberts. I think that was such a pull from Trump's playbook, and I liked it. I have to say,
I thought it was it was very entertaining. It was very dramatic, but it was really a bad answer because he was supposed to answer why him and not Trump. Now, to focus on the media, it's almost like saying, well, if I were president, I would attack the media more than Trump. I don't think that's even possible. Or if I were president, I would, revamp the Republican National Committee, the RNC. When you're president, you say who the RNC head is. So these people, these names aren't even known to the broader electorate. Ronna McDaniel, the DNC, and other things like that. So that I thought that was a mistake. I thought the word cancer was a bit strong. I mean, especially if you use the word, you have to say what it is. If it's a cancer, it can't be some RNC head for a few years. Yes, there have been losses in these elections. I think it's really interesting that he mentioned the losses the other night in the off-year elections, because in Ohio, Kentucky, and Virginia, one of the reasons the GOP did so badly was because they were outvoted on abortion measures. So in Ohio, Kentucky, and Virginia, especially Ohio, which is considered a Republican state, the voters extended women's right to choose. In other words, they were reacting against the Dobbs decision, which was made possible by Trump putting 3 justices on the court and overthrowing Roe v. Wade. So notice, though, Ramaswamy didn't go there. He didn't say, we lost the other night and we've been losing, say, in the midterm election of 2022 because of the abortion issue. None of them want to say that because they're all against, they're all for repealing Roe v. Wade. So I thought that was interesting. That was kind of like the elephant in the room. And he didn't go there, but that is a major thing the Republican Party has to deal with. And the only one who even gives any hint of going light on this, on women's right to choose, is Nikki Haley. But even she just wants it at the state level. So I didn't think this was a good answer by Vivek. His other answers were very good on foreign policy and other things, but this wasn't.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know Vivek, he polls really well with young people, and
Yeah.
you get a lot of young, not so much your young conservatives, but your young libertarians that are kind of merging with young conservatives who are more pro-choice. So it is becoming an issue that Republicans used to be able to say, I'm pro-life, and that was an automatic win. And now it
Right.
appears that's not, it's hurting them, which is an interesting shift. So.
Right. Another way to judge these people, Abby, is you look and you say, well, they're not really presidential material. What other job might be good for them? You know, and some of them might be Treasury Secretary, and someone might be Labor Secretary. Vivek Ramaswamy would be good as the head of the RNC. He should take Ronna McDaniel's position. I think he actually was thinking about it at some point. Doesn't matter. Yeah. But as head of the Republican Party, trying to get young, vivacious voters in there, he'd be good at that. But that's not the same thing as the presidency. And part of the reason of that is not to dismiss him, but he does not have government experience, and that really hurts. But he's very polemical and very smart and very active and vibrant, and that you do need the RNC to be headed by someone like that.
Yeah, and I think there's a strategy where, he knows he's not going to probably be the next president of the United States, but it seems like a new strategy for launching a political career is just to start with launching for the top because it gets you the most exposure in the media. So then he'll trickle down and land somewhere else. I think we see this happen. So then, of course, they went on to, what's been in the news probably the most in the past few weeks, which is the war between Israel and Hamas. So this is where I want to jump in with Nikki Haley here, because obviously she was part of the UN. She often is touted as somebody with a lot of foreign policy experience. I'm not huge on her foreign policy myself as a young person and not a neocon. Like you said, she's pretty hawkish. But if we want to roll here, this question starting at, I guess, 12:27, they ask all of the candidates are going to respond to, what do you urge Benjamin Netanyahu to do in Israel right now?
Yeah.
So if you want to start there, Lawrence, that'd be our next clip.
And civilian casualties mount inside Gaza. As President of the United States, what would you be urging Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do at this moment? Governor DeSantis.
I would be telling Bibi, finish the job once and for all with these butchers, Hamas. They're terrorists. They're massacring innocent people. They would wipe every Jew off the globe if they could. He cannot live with that threat right by his country. That Hamas should release every hostage and they should unconditionally surrender. I'm sick of hearing the media, I'm sick of hearing other people blame Israel just for defending itself. We will stand with Israel in word and in deed, in public and in private. And I can tell you, as governor, I actually did something about it. Biden's neglect has been atrocious. We had Floridians that were over there after the attack. He left them stranded. They couldn't get flights out. So I scrambled resources in Florida. I sent planes over to Israel, and I brought back over 700 people to safety. There could have been more hostages had we not acted. And I'll tell you this, I met the first plane load when they came to Florida, and one of the mothers pointed to a 6-year-old daughter, and she said, my daughter had been saying the last 2 nights, Mommy, I don't want to hear any more bombs, no more rockets. I just want to get back to Florida. So there's a difference between words and deeds. We acted and we saved lives.
Thank you. Ambassador Haley, what would you do? What would you be urging Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do? Would you consider a humanitarian pause, for example?
The first thing I said to him when it happened was I said, finish them. Finish them. And the reason is I worked on this every day when I was at the United Nations. And we have to remember that they have to, 1, eliminate Hamas, 2, support Israel with whatever they need whenever they need it, and 3, make sure we bring our hostages home. We need to be very clear-eyed to know there would be no Hamas without Iran. There would be no Hezbollah without Iran. There would not be the Houthis without Iran. And there wouldn't be the Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq that are trying to hit our military men and women if it hadn't been for Iran. And who is funding Iran right now? China is buying oil from Iran. Russia is getting drones and missiles from Iran. And there is an unholy alliance. We need to be clear-eyed. The last thing we need to do is to tell Israel what to do. The only thing we should be doing is supporting them and eliminating Hamas. It is not that Israel needs America. America needs Israel. They are the tip of the spear when it comes to this Islamic terrorism, and we need to make sure that we have their backs in that process.
All right. Thank you.
Well, a couple of things about this before I forget what she just said. The tip of the spear is really quite a statement, because notice what it means. And they say this about Ukraine as well. Scott said this about Ukraine. They're being used by the U.S. to fight other countries. That's really improper. Israel can be an ally. I'm not saying Ukraine should be. Israel is definitely an ally, but it's not the tip of a spear held by the United States to go after terrorist groups. Israel can take care of terrorist groups on its own very well, thank you. The IDF and the Hamas. Actually, the reason they haven't is the U.S. has restrained them over the years. You can tell this even from Lester Holt saying, what about a humanitarian pause? What would you tell Bibi what to do? Clearly, the bias was to tell him to stop responding to the attack of October 7th. These candidates should have been much more forceful in rejecting that premise from Holt. A humanitarian pause is just another way to resupply Hamas. The other thing is Nikki Haley said that Iran has made possible Hamas, Hezbollah and others. Partly true, definitely true, but so did Israel. The shocking story coming out of here is Israeli officials have admitted over the years that they promoted Hamas as an alternative to the PLO. For those of you who remember Yasser Arafat over the years, it's the same policy that the U.S. tried in trying to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan by backing, guess what, Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen and bin Laden in the 80s. This pragmatist, short-term myopic policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, but this is a reason for Israel to wake up and say, we're not going to do this anymore, and we are going to get rid of Hamas. I'm not sure they really will. They should. But it would take an effort to say, as Ramaswamy advised, don't take advice from the U.S. now, because all the advice coming from the U.S., Blinken, Biden, Austin, is telling Israel to restrain itself, basically to not retaliate as it should. DeSantis, by the way, not a bad answer, but the second half of the answer was entirely Red Cross type stuff. I mean, you're the commander in chief. Let the Red Cross handle refugees. Let the Red Cross meet people at the airport and give them food and shelter. But it was kind of a weak answer from DeSantis. He should have focused on, remember, the question was, what would you advise Israel in a time of war? And you're the commander-in-chief of America. You're not the head of the Red Cross and the UN. So I think DeSantis's answer was kind of weak, actually.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, I think for the person, for a lot of people who are very emotionally persuaded, that might be a very good answer in their mind.
It might.
DeSantis actually did something in the child at the airport.
Right. I think that's exactly why he said it. He's constantly contrasting himself with Biden. Either has the wrong policies or he's inactive and in his basement sleeping, and I'm out there actively doing something. That's true.
Yeah, interestingly, what I've noticed is Nikki Haley And a lot of these candidates they will say the word support. They use where we want to support Israel, we want to support Ukraine, and they do not want to really get specific on what that would mean for them. Clearly, it means a lot of money, U.S. money, going to these countries.
Right.
But when asked, in the next question, she's actually pressed to ask if she would put military boots on the ground to fight Iran, and she dodges that, clear out of the water. So it kind of scares me as a young American who, I could be drafted, my significant other could be drafted. I mean, I don't know, I guess I can't right now, but what does that mean when we talk about boots on the ground? And Ron DeSantis says unequivocally, no boots on the ground. But also talking about Hamas, I talked about this a little bit. The United States, our policy with Hamas was a policy of moderation. Treat them like a political entity, and they'll become a solvent political entity. So if anything, we should be looking in the mirror now as partially, enabling this issue.
Yeah, and we got to the point where we promoted the idea of an election in 2006, and there was an election. So there's an election in the Gaza. They voted for Hamas, and then there hasn't been an election since. So, one man, one vote, one time. That's a very common, again, the failure of the idea of democracy in a country that has no clue what it is. And they just vote in their next tyrants. And bad enough, and then those tyrants go attack Israel because their sole job is to get rid of Israel. I mean, and the two-state solution, the fact that we're even hearing about that at all is so tired, it's so old, and it's so wrong. They don't want two states, they want zero states. They don't want a state themselves, and they want to get rid of the Israeli state. So to create another state sponsor of terrorism, I mean, anyone from the State Department or the Defense Department who's saying that is advocating another state sponsor of terrorism by having Hamas have a state in Gaza.
So we get another question after this on, use of military force in Iran. Nikki Haley says we need to take out the infrastructure in Iraq and Syria. DeSantis says we're not putting troops on the ground. And then we jump to, kind of keep moving through because we've got a lot of foreign policy in this debate. They jump to the next question, which was actually about, Jewish students being under attack on universities. And then they focus a lot on universities. I thought this was interesting, the differences between some of the candidates here. So if we want to play, the question was, what would you say to universities and students? And I actually this was the one question where I liked Tim Scott's response. If we want to play that, Lawrence, at 2531. So they ask specifically about what would be done in universities, what would be done to students, if you were president. Ramaswamy comes right out and says censorship is not the answer. I thought that was interesting. He says we need to, address the root causes. We shouldn't be disbanding these student groups. He calls out DeSantis and Nikki Haley for wanting censorship. And then Tim Scott comes in with an answer that I thought was pretty good. So I'll play this and then get your thoughts on the two sides here.
You to weigh in on what you just heard.
Well, let me just say to every single university president in America, federal funding is a privilege, not a right. Number one. Number two, to every student who've come to our country on a visa to a college campus, your visa is a privilege, not a right. Number three, any campus that allows for anti-Semitism and hate, to allow students to encourage terrorism, mass murder, and genocide, you should lose your federal funding today, period. To all the students on visas who are encouraging Jewish genocide, I would deport you from those campuses. We have to stand strong with our Jewish Americans. At the end of the day, we should not have our Jewish students in a library being told to hide. On our streets in New York, a Jewish citizen has the right to walk on the streets of America with no fear. They have the right to go to college campuses, go to class, and not fear. We will restore that. I started working on anti-Semitism on college campuses in 2017, because even then there was a rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses. We must force the people off those campuses and
Senator
frankly,
Scott, thank you. Let me
out of our country.
Let me turn to the guy.
Kind of surmising his point. So I guess my question for you is what is your take on what should be done? I mean, you're on a college campus and
Well, I thought this answer was very sensorial, and it's closer to DeSantis's position. I think I embrace closer Vivek's answer, which we don't have here, but I can summarize. Now, notice what he said. Government funding of colleges is a right, not a privilege. The visas for foreign students is a privilege, not a right. You could back up, but this would be kind of radical to say, why is there any federal funding of universities? I mean, especially these ones with these huge endowments. But it is true to notice, once you pay the piper, you have to go to his tune. So this is Scott basically saying, do what we say, dear campuses, or we will defund you. It is a bit of an interventionist kind of censorship type answer. Now, on the visas, I'm less bothered there because the U.S. should be able to control its border and decide who comes in or not. But you always should vet people who are either, contagious or tied to terrorists or funding terrorists. But I think Vivek was right that if people are advocating certain ideas on campuses which are vile, by the way, including anti-Semitism. I mean, in my philosophy, it's also including anti-rich people and anti-capitalism, not necessarily on the same level. There has to be free speech. But to the extent the universities at all are funding or helping aid and abet terrorist groups named by the State Department as terrorist groups, that is a problem. Now, where you draw the line and how far you go, I think Scott went too far. So I'm for free speech. And I actually think one of the problems with shutting down free speech and cancel culture is these people can hide in the shadows. In a way, it's better that, 31 student groups at Harvard stood up for Hamas. And everyone can identify who they were. And pretty soon they realized they were in a bad position. They were having job offers rescinded and things like that. So transparency here is very good. Let's identify. And of course, the more transparent it is, the more you could see, are these just stupid students marching for something that seems popular on campus, or are they actually in helping Hamas? Now you can help distinguish, the real criminal activity versus the mere stupid activity. So DeSantis was criticized by Ramaswamy on this because in Florida, he and Chris Rufo and others have been very clear about routing out sympathizers, including Confucius Institutes, which are financed by China in the colleges. And of course, they're getting the complaint that they're violating freedom of speech and academic freedom. But this has always been a problem, when people complain about what's taught in the public schools, whether it's evolution, say, or intelligent design. The real problem is it's government funding, and once it's government funding, people will fight over what is permitted to be taught or not. So it would have been nice to have an answer where someone said, we shouldn't be heavily funding the universities, but that's not really what the question was about. So here, the best answer is, as commander-in-chief, as president of the United States, it's perfectly okay for us to identify enemies of the United States that represent an existential threat to the United States or its allies like Israel. And if we find them anywhere, whether on college campuses or on marching on the Brooklyn Bridge, we get to arrest them. We do get to arrest and try them at least every bit as much as the so-called insurrectionists of January 6th.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I liked the idea that, when he says, it's a privilege, not a right, I did like that part of the answer, but I definitely side with Vivek more as well. And if you want, we can play that clip. Vivek, talked a lot about leadership, not censorship. So we can play, Vivek's answer. It was in stark contrast because everybody else sided with Tim Scott. Ron DeSantis said the DOJ should be on college campuses. Thought that was a strong response. Talk about kind of chilling speech a little bit. I think that would be challenged in the courts. And then, Nikki Haley chimes in with a response about how college presidents would be reacting if this were the KKK, which, they probably would react differently, just pointing out their kind of, how they're not consistent. But at the same time, none of it was a very good answer, as you said.
And also, you got to give credit to Vivek. We don't have to play his segment, but he's talking about how he's talking on the base of ideas. And he reminded people of the book he wrote a few years back on woke. And he's very much of the idea of expose these people, refute these people, dilute it to the point of being irrelevant. It's kind of like what was done with the Nazi doctrine in the 1930s and 40s. It wasn't just that on the battlefield we decimated them. It also became embarrassing and shameful for anyone to, espouse alleged Aryan ideals and anti-Semitism after that. And that's what Ramaswamy is calling for. And I think it's very powerful because it shows confidence in your message, not that you have to shut down free speech, but that you can so easily refute it. And what did he call the students at one point? These students are fools. They have no idea what they're talking about. And that is more embarrassing, to call a college student someone who's ignorant is much more embarrassing than saying, your views are so powerful, I'm going to jail you or defund you, which is kind of like what Scott was saying.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and we'll run it so that when people have a reference when they're watching. I think it was one of his stronger responses.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the scourge of anti-Semitism across this country, including at places like my alma maters and places like Brooklyn Bridge in New York, it's sad to see, but here's what history teaches us. Anti-Semitism is a symptom of a deeper cancer in a country and a society that is lost, and we are lost. Several years ago, when I wrote my first book, Woke Inc., I was talking about they were chanting death to America, death to white people, death to Christians. Nobody was waking up back then. Now it's even bad. Now they're saying death to Israel and worse. So it is wrong, but we have to get to the root cause here. Now, I think it's really important that we do this through leadership, not censorship. Leadership means fill that void with purpose and meaning. Dilute this wokeism and anti-Semitism to irrelevance. These kids, they have no idea what the heck they're even talking about when they're siding with Hamas over Israel. They are fools. But I also want to caution here, if we go the direction of Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley, with whom I respectfully disagree on this issue, pro-censorship, telling student groups to disband, mark my words, soon they will say if you question a vaccine and its side effects, you're a bioterrorist. Soon they will say that if you show up at a school board meeting, you're a domestic terrorist. Soon if they say that J6 prisoners should be released, you're an insurrectionist terrorist. So that's where this road ends. We don't quash this with censorship because that creates a worse underbelly. We quell it through leadership by calling it out. These university administrators have lost their way, and we need leadership at the top in the United States of America that restores our founding values and that has no place for this kind of anti-Semitic hate. That's where I stand while respecting our Constitution.
Your time is out. Senator Scott.
Yeah, I like this answer very much. And again, you could see the power of him saying, listen, we have better ideas than they do. They're ignoramuses and they're vile to boot. By the way, he could have added something that's been in the headlines recently, namely the defunding of by alums. They're mostly Jewish alums, which is perfectly fine, but many, Leon Cooperman and others, many top investors on Wall Street and others have stepped forward and said, I'm defunding, I'm not sending any more money to my alma mater. So, but notice that would also be a kind of voluntary free market way of approaching this by saying, one way, and that'll really get the attention of these endowments. If you say your rich alums aren't going to support you anymore, and that isn't government censorship, notice, that's just free will talking. By the way, I just wanted to enter into the record. I know it's previous, but it's also Vivek and how different he was. I think on the issue of Ukraine and foreign policy, I wrote this down because it's so powerful. In the prior question, Vivek said the following: corrupt politicians in both parties spent trillions, killed millions, and made billions for themselves in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Fighting was that sent thousands of our sons and daughters, people my age, to die in wars that did not advance anyone's interests, and in addition, adding $7 trillion to the national debt. Unquote. Now that is Trump. That was the Trump message of 2016. Forever wars. And not just that, wars that the U.S. did not win because it really didn't commit itself to winning, or chose the wrong target to begin with. That's a very courageous thing to say on a Republican stage. It's one of the reasons Trump is hated by both sides, by the way, that the neocon Hillary Clinton types and the John McCain types in both parties really are not just for war, but for wars where our hands are tied behind our backs and we can't win it. Vivek is against those, and he still has this standard, which is proper, of national self-interest. And for him to say no interests were served in doing this, you're talking about a purely self-sacrificing and sacrificing policy, which he rejects, and I'm glad he did. So he's very different on all these things, but it makes him a perfect candidate to head the RNC, as I said before.
Yeah, and that was actually one of my favorite answers of his. I didn't have him play it because there's all this infighting that we talked about, but that's right before he says his next line was, "Do you want me or do you want Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels?"
Right, he did say that. Yes, and also again the idea of looking ahead and who are they targeting? All these answers on anti-Semitism could have, and Hamas could have really highlighted the fact that the Democrats, who control the universities predominantly, are allowing this. And again, it's not for purposes of bringing up government censorship, but just pointing out, notice how different the Republican Party is on Israel, on anti-Semitism, on terrorism, and whether you coddle them or not. And we're very different from the Democrats. The Democrats are coddling all these things and allowing all these things. And Tlaib and the Squad. I mean, those are in the headlines now. These guys should have been citing the fact that the Democratic Party is awful on anti-Semitism, on support for Israel, and things like that. They neglected to say that, actually.
Yeah. And the Democrat Party is dealing with their own sort of issues with their youth, because their youth are not, these are the ones out there in the streets not supporting Israel. And a lot of their sort of older Democratic left are very supportive of Israel. And I think they're starting to see the big difference between your far left, young people and your traditional Democrats. So they continue to go on through foreign policy. They talk a little bit about Ukraine, which I believe they talked a lot about in the last debate. So they asked, Zelensky, I guess, came out and said that the U.S. was going to have to put boots on the ground to defend NATO allies, and, made this, strong statement. And everybody, kind of dodged the answer about how much more support they were going to give to Ukraine. Vivek was the only one who, again, was pretty strong on, Ukraine is not a paragon of democracy. We can play that if you want. But then I thought that the kind of shocking answer and the very neocon answer was Chris Christie talking about, comparing this moment to pre-World War II. Like, we have to get in there,
Right. And he said, this is just getting the band back together. He thinks that Putin, which is total, there's no evidence of this. He thinks Putin is trying to re-establish the USSR imperialist empire, which at one point had, 13 or 14 satellites, including Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, and things like that. And at one point he said, after Ukraine, he's going to take over the Baltics and then Poland.
Right.
I mean, if that were true and likely, really all he's creating is a demilitarized zone of rubble so that NATO doesn't go into Ukraine, period. I've talked about this before, but yeah, Christie was very hawkish on this, but the most hawkish, and I think the most dangerous, I don't know if you have the clip, is Scott.
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't think he's a viable candidate, but that view in the Republican Party is there. And it's kind of like the McCain and McConnell and Lindsey Graham wing. And I have the quote because it's really quite interesting. He says, this is Senator Scott, I've been supporting Ukraine, and we must state America's vital interest in this, which is the following, and I'm quoting, it is in degrading the Russian military. That's the goal. We've been very effective in using our resources and weaponry and Ukrainian blood to advance that objective. Every day that we get closer to degrading the Russian military, that's good. In the end, we have to destroy the Russian military. And you know that NATO's 5th article triggers our involvement if any NATO member is hit. To eliminate that possibility, we must destroy the Russian military. And by destroying the Russian military, we keep our own military at home, unquote. That is the truth speaking out loud. That is really quite an admission that Ukraine is being sacrificed purposely, deliberately. They're using Ukraine. Talk about tip of the spear. Ukraine is so corrupt and so incompetent that it hasn't been eligible to go into NATO in the last 30 years, even though the U.S. has added a whole bunch of countries to NATO. One of the reasons Ukraine could never get in is precisely because of what Vivek described it as. It's a corrupt, autocratic, authoritarian country, and you wouldn't trust them with NATO instruments, and you wouldn't trust that they wouldn't get in a fight with Russia and bring us into World War III. And so, but Tim Scott noticed that is the view. The view is we need to destroy Putin and Russia and pose an existential threat to Russia. Now, interestingly, Hillary agrees. So Hillary and Scott agree on this. That Hillary hates the fact that she thinks Putin robbed her of the 2016 election. That's not true, but it's what they believe. So there's the alliance between the Democrat hawks and the Tim Scott type hawks, who you can see what their motive is. Their motive is not to liberate Ukraine from anything. Their motive is to use Ukraine as a tip of the spear to dislodge and depose Putin, as they did with Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi in Libya, and all those countries that were left in disarray afterwards.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you kind of summed up, you kind of ran his whole quote. We do have all the clips from
the
question. So if you want, we can play it for the record, or
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, play it for the record. I'll make sure you get it right.
Yeah, play Tim Scott here, because him and Chris Christie were pretty hawkish.
Yeah.
Certainly have been very supportive of Ukraine. I believe that ultimately we should make sure that the President of the United States states what is America's national vital interest in Ukraine. It is actually in degrading the Russian military. We've been very effective using our resources and our weaponry and the incredibly high price of Ukrainian blood to achieve that objective. Every day we get closer to the degradation of the Russian military, and that's good news. But the American people are frustrated that they do not have a president who reminds us and tells us, where's the accountability? Where are those dollars? How are those dollars being spent? We need those answers for us to continue to see the support for Ukraine. And at the same time, I would say that a package that's been offered by the president for Ukraine and Israel, that's the wrong approach. We need to focus specifically on providing Israel with the $14 billion that they need so that we show the world that we are 100% undeniably standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel. And then as we turn away from that direct support for Israel, we should go to our southern border and close our southern border with the resources necessary. I believe that we have sleeper terrorist cells in America. Thousands of people have come from Yemen, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. If we are going to deal with the national security emergency at our border, we have to do it now.
Senator Scott, thank you.
All right, yeah. So then directly following that is Vivek, who couldn't give more of an opposite response to that. So we can play that as well if you'd like, or we can move on to they go on to talk about China next. So they're kind of covering all of our foreign enemies. But
Yeah, you can play Vivek.
yeah, let's go ahead and play Vivek.
Yeah.
Talking, pretty much in opposition to these points.
Unpersuaded. And I'm actually enjoying watching the Ukraine hawks quietly, delicately tiptoe back from their position as this thing has unwound into a disaster. The first half of this race, I was the only person standing for it. Now they're actually quietly coming around to being more cautious, as they should. Level with the American people here. Ukraine is not a paragon of democracy. This is a country that has banned 11 opposition parties. It has consolidated all media into one state TV media arm. That's not democratic. It has threatened not to hold elections this year unless the U.S. forks over more money. That is not democratic. It has celebrated a Nazi in its ranks, the comedian in cargo pants, a man called Zelensky, doing it in their own ranks. That is not democratic. More facts for you that you won't hear from the mainstream in either party or the mainstream media. The regions of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia right now, in the Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk. These are Russian-speaking regions that have not even been part of Ukraine since 2014, that other people probably couldn't name those provinces for you. Those are the hard facts. And so to frame this as some kind of battle between good versus evil, don't buy it. And I'd like the likes of the sharpest of the war hawks on Ukraine, Nikki Haley, to have some accountability and answer. Do you want to use U.S. taxpayer money to fund the banning of Christians? That is actually what's happening. They're using the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They have banned them. The Ukrainian parliament just did this last week, supported by our dollars. And I think you owe it to the American people, Nikki, to at least this one time
Ramaswamy, thank you. That's time.
At least.
By the way, an answer, I love that answer. He couldn't say it better than I have. And like him, I feel very lonely because for the past year in my own circles, I've been saying this and I was condemned for it as being pro-Putin, which is ridiculous. But by the way, you're probably not going to play it, but the very next response from Nikki Haley was to say, quote, Putin and Xi of China are salivating in the hopes that you'll be president, unquote. Well, that's interesting because he's not president. His view is a minority view. The view that's been adopted widely by both sides and enacted is the hawkish Nikki Haley, John McCain, Lindsey Graham view. And guess what pushed the two together? That view. I mean, Russia and China are allied now, largely because of the approach of pushing NATO right to Russia's border. And what's happened since the war began in February 22? They added Finland to NATO. And Finland, I think, is an 800-mile border with Russia. So if anything, Russia said, listen, we told you not to bring Ukraine and NATO, which amounts to America, to our border. And the response is to bring NATO into Finland. They're just, you can tell their motivation is to go to war with Russia, to effectively have World War III. And Russia's answer is, good, how about if we ally with China? So the idea that Nikki Haley, who was in the administration, who's in the UN, who has this policy, who had the backing, who was really violating Trump's policy. Trump wasn't for this. For her to turn around and say Vivek is the one who's threatening to bring Russia and China together is really quite disingenuous of her.
Yeah, I think, you know, just looking at even what's happening with these BRICS nations and things like that, we're looking at, you know, a direct response and a direct move away from the US dollar, a direct coalition of our enemies in response to the US policy. So the fact that people like Nikki Haley can even get away with saying, you know, what they say just kind of shows that they don't take the American people very seriously in what we know or understand. And maybe that's warranted. Maybe most Americans don't know or understand what's happened with Russia and China and, you know, India and these other, you know, they're coming together. And I don't know what you think, Richard, about what the average American, you know, paying attention to these things. Do you think people can see right through this, or do you think Republicans still think Nikki Haley's right?
I think the predominant view, although they get tired of long wars that aren't won, they tend not to pay attention while they're going on. But since both parties tend in this direction, you'd have to say that their voters predominantly in each party also believe the same thing. I would just infer that. But you can look at polls. They usually start with, yeah, let's go to war. And a year later, it's like, why are we doing this again? It's a very common thing. Let's remember also, by the way, that whatever alliance now is building between or has built between Russia and China, it's not really military. These two do not want to be sharing military secrets. It's what it is after Russia invaded Ukraine, there were sanctions on Russia. So they couldn't sell their oil or their natural. And then the U.S. blew up the pipeline under the Baltic Sea. The U.S. did that. They blew up a pipeline bringing natural gas into Germany. So the U.S. blew up an energy supply of a NATO ally. Unbelievable, just to get at Russia. And so what they did was they turned to China and said, why don't you buy our oil and then sell it all to the rest of the world to bypass the sanctions. So the sanctions haven't worked. The economic sanctions against Russia have not worked at all. The Russian economy is growing faster than the U.S. economy, even though they're at war. So it really wasn't. Nikki Haley's wrong to say, wow, you've put Russia and China into a military alliance, you know, that's about to attack us. That's utter nonsense. What the Biden policy did was put Russia and China together economically and trade more with each other because we won't trade with Russia anymore. And Europe did the same thing. Europe said, we're going to stop taking Russian exports of food and energy and everything. So Russia said, good, we'll send it to China. That's what the deal was.
And I think we're starting to see the real consequences of not drilling for our own oil, because even tying it back to Israel, Saudi Arabia has just said, well, we'll stop selling oil to anybody if Israel doesn't do a ceasefire. So, and then again, I think the only candidate to talk about how we need to drill, frack, well, they all mentioned it a little bit, but we had VIVEK very strong on drill, frack. Scott was very strong on it. So I think all of them have committed to, you know, American, oil supply and natural gas supply.
Yes.
Become president. So we'll see, you know.
Yeah, this group is very good on energy, and most of them will say good things about nuclear power as well. Some of them on the Venezuela question criticized Biden for turning to Venezuela for oil. And Venezuela is a socialist basket case, you know, fully endorsed and backed by Sanders and AOC over the years. And they're so bad. They used to have a vibrant oil industry. They don't produce a drop of oil anymore. So socialism is totally, they nationalized and killed their oil industry. And of course, the environmentalists love that because they've reduced their carbon footprint. But that's where Biden goes for oil now, which is totally ridiculous.
Yeah. So the next question they actually go to, though, is the Chinese Communist Party. And this one I'm interested in getting your take on, because from an objectivist perspective, we talk a lot about, you know, free trade is a real pinnacle there. And we've talked before in our, you know, in Morals and Markets and different webinars about trade with China and how you're not in support of, you know, some of the things that Trump did in his policy with China. And all of the candidates come out very strong against China. And so I just wanted to, you know, before we play any clips here, I wanted to get your, you know, your position on trade with China, you know, as it stands now.
Yes. The quick background on this is, yes, they were a terrible Maoist communist country from 1949 until he died. Mao died in 1976. A couple of years later, they liberalized. So China moved away from communism. They started privatizing certain land and certain they left certain cities completely alone, like Shanghai, which has grown into an enormous metropolis with huge skyscrapers. It looks more modern and more capitalistic than New York City. Yes, Hong Kong was turned over to China from Britain, but they pretty much left China alone for many years. The only intervention of late has been, well, they don't want that parliament overtaken by local Democrats who would just get rid of the free market system in Hong Kong. So even that Hong Kong controversy, I think, was misinterpreted. But the real bad policy was Trump having a trade war with China. And that wasn't because China was some kind of military threat to the United States. It wasn't. Now, the Soviet Union of old was. The Soviet Union of old said, we want to vanquish you. But China, bad as it was under Mao, was never imperialistic, at least toward the United States. And so that trade war idea was very bad. It was based on bad economics. It was based on Trump thinking that the U.S. manufacturing was cored out due to China sending us stuff. No, it was cored out because the EPA and regulatory regimes and tax regimes and labor union policies in the United States cored out manufacturing. So that began an antagonism with China, which did not help. And notice that China didn't help at all on the Wuhan virus. It came from China. It interestingly, I don't have a conspiracy theory here, but that was one thing they did export to Trump. They exported a virus and ruined his administration and made Trump an authoritarian, imposing fascism on us. Amazing. I'm not saying they did it purposely, but that was the ultimate effect. And notice that the only Trump policy that Biden has not reversed. Biden did not come in and get rid of the tariffs and the trade war with China. He kept it. So that's the background to this, but I'm very much in a minority here. If I thought China was a military and existential threat either to the United States or, by the way, to Taiwan or to Hong Kong, I'd agree with these candidates, but I don't believe it. And when they talk about the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP exists mostly in name only. They're not imposing, and they haven't for years, a communist regime in China. If that were true, why is it so prosperous? The conservatives cannot answer the question about why China is existentially and undeniably prosperous as the Soviet Union never was. And that is only possible because they moved toward a more capitalist system, not because they remained communist. So the conservatives would have to say communism all of a sudden is very prosperous, or we're wrong about calling it communist.
Well, and we have candidates like Nikki Haley goes as far as to say, and a quote, she would end all formal trade relations with China.
She did say that, yes.
End the sale of fentanyl. That was her
her
asterisk on that. But I don't even think the average American can really contemplate what that would do, what that would mean.
Right. And well, notice also, Abby, she's using it to leverage the foreign policy advice in Ukraine, because she'll say, if we don't help Ukraine, then China's going to attack Taiwan. Do you know how many decades conservatives have been saying that China is going to invade Taiwan? It's been going on since 1978.
Right.
Literally, it's been going on for almost 40 more years. They're going to attack Taiwan, and therefore we should help Ukraine. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't. There's no message being sent to China other than U.S. foreign policy is stupid and self-sacrificial, and the U.S. gets in forever wars and then loses them. I mean, China is just laughing at how bad we are at war, but it could have long ago invaded Taiwan. It has no reason to invade or overtake or communize Taiwan. It's ridiculous.
Well, this whole question and this whole conversation they had about China made me feel very young and not quite aware of what was happening.
Right, of the history, right.
I talk about Ronald Reagan and the
right.
Navy ships and China's Navy ships, and I was like, I have no point of reference here. So
right.
It was interesting because you only get to hear what's happening in your generation, and then they tell you their perspective what was happening in the past. So it's an interesting. So interestingly enough, they asked them, is our Navy big enough to defeat China? And I guess they have more ships than us. I don't know. I really don't know anything.
Right. But did you notice the questioner was Hugh Hewitt? And talk about, here's a Democrat from, I think he calls himself a centrist, but here he is on an NBC panel, and he's so hawkish. He's like taunting all the candidates to up their estimate of how big they'll build the military-industrial complex. It's just hilarious.
This is a straight answer. I'm asking for a specific number.
Yeah. And all the smuggled premises. Hey, candidate, how much will you increase government spending in order to fight this phantom called China's trying to take us over? It was unbelievable. And this is not the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party of old would be suspicious of these imperialist, adventurous things that are only harming American interests. Not always, because the Democrat Party has supported a lot of bad U.S. wars, but yeah, the hawkishness from that panel, especially from Hugh Hewitt, was just over the top. And sadly, most of the candidates were, bidding against each other to say how much they would build up a navy to go against China, who has no interest in invading Taiwan. Amazing.
And then Vivek comes in again with an interesting answer about how we depend on them for all of the parts for our military planes and our semiconductors and our pharmaceuticals.
Right. And the semiconductor chips, which used to be dominant in Silicon Valley, are now mostly produced in Taipei. Well, see, the hawks will say all the more reason why we really need to be aggressive against China and protect Taipei. But if they're increasing the chance of a war, which they are, by pretending to want to defend Taiwan, it's just sad. It's just a sad turn of events.
Yeah, and this was the one place where I noted Chris Christie came in and had, looked a little bit good. I don't know if we want to play one clip from Chris Christie.
Sure, yeah, sure. Put in Chris.
Leave him out here entirely.
Yeah, don't leave Chris out. Yeah.
Nuclear submarines. If we want to play that 49-17, it was an interesting.
Yeah.
He says, I'm the only one. There we go.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And my second observation is these three in the middle think they're the enemy. I know China is the enemy, and that's what we should be focused on. So let's be really clear. The nuclear submarines in this United States Navy is the greatest deterrent to Chinese aggression, and that is the first place I would go to increase American naval power. Our nuclear submarines are able to move stealthily, quietly, and effectively. And if we are going to deter China from invading Taiwan, the only way we're going to do it is to make sure that they don't know whether how many nuclear submarines from the United States of America are in the South China Sea and in that area and ready to strike on them if they decide to move on Taiwan. And so we, as our first priority, need to go directly to our nuclear sub-program, Hugh, and we need to increase it drastically. That would be priority number one. Ships would come next, but to me, the ships are secondary choice here. The submarines are the single most important thing that we could be using to deter China. But the other thing we could do to deter China is to let them know that the blood money they're spending for Russia in Ukraine right now will not be effective, that we send Putin home with his tail between his legs and make them understand that the same fate waits for them if they decide to move towards Taiwan. With a more aggressive nuclear sub-program, we'll be able to make that threat real.
Thank you, Governor. We're going to
He's launching a nuclear threat.
Notice there was no follow-up from the very hawkish Hugh, whatever his name is, Hugh Hewitt. Hugh Hewitt's follow-up question should have been, did I hear you right, Governor, that you would nuke China?
Right.
You are talking about nuclear subs. You would nuke China if they invaded Taiwan, even though they've never invaded Taiwan since Taiwan became independent. And yeah, they do flyovers and they're in the Taiwan Straits and everything, but mostly to show that the American government shouldn't be there. The American military shouldn't be there. No one called that as a follow-up. I mean, what would he have said? Yeah, I'd launch nukes on China if they invaded Taiwan. Now, would it be a bad thing if they invaded Taiwan? Yeah, it would be hard for us to get computer chips. And the free people and wonderful people of Taiwan would be subjugated. But as I said before, there isn't any evidence whatever when these people use the word Chinese aggression, deter Chinese aggression. I put it to any of these people, please list in the last 10, 15 years, examples of Chinese aggression against America. The answer is zip, nada, bupkis. There isn't any. And even the idea of, wow, we see China building installations on islands in the South China Sea. Let me repeat that, in the South China Sea.
Also
this would be like the U.S. having installations in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico? No one would see that as a threat. It's ridiculous. Of course, the South China Sea would be of interest to China. It doesn't mean it's a launching pad to go to war. Neither China nor Russia, since they've become freer, have posed, verbally or otherwise, an existential threat to the United States. And yet these candidates are talking as if that's true for purpose of ginning up U.S. military spending and involvement in forever wars that are lost. It's really terrible.
Yeah, and the one thing that they'll say is, well, China is being really subtle about it. They're, poisoning us with fentanyl. They're buying up all our land. The big conspiracy is that, one day we're just going to wake up and we're going to be completely owned by China. Do you think that there's legitimate?
Yeah, notice how they're mixing the economic with the military. It is true that historically military powers cannot remain military powers unless they have strong economies. So in this particular case, they look and they say, oh my God, China is getting a stronger and stronger and more formidable, bigger economy. Well, my view would be good. That didn't happen under Mao, didn't happen under Stalin and Lenin and Soviet Union. If they're growing as an economy, it's to any pro-capitalist, it should be obvious. You can infer from that they're becoming a freer country. Now, it's a big step to therefore say, therefore, they're going to build up their military and take us over. So they're going to take us over as much as they have the shelves at Walmart with their goods. I mean, it's so maniacal. It's just ridiculous to conclude that. You would have to conclude the same thing about on the eve of World War I, say, wow, the American economy has become really robust and it's the biggest economy in the world. It looks like the US is about to invade Europe. That's not what happened. The US had to go over and save Europe from itself in World War I. So it's just a non sequitur to go from economic prowess is building, therefore military prowess is building, therefore military prowess is going to go and vanquish the United States. This is what these war hawks are ginning up for purpose of, well, their own maniacal purposes, but there isn't any evidence for that whole storyline, especially when you see a country becoming freer and more prosperous. Of course, they should have a military, especially when they have both parties in America threatening to go to war and send nuke subs into China. Of course, they would build up their military for defensive purposes alone.
Right. We had that, it's hard to say. We can never say, what would Ayn Rand think? What would Ayn Rand say in this moment? That's kind of a mistake, I think, when people try to do that. But, she had her famous, quote on, savagery and making no apologies for savagery.
Yeah.
And, so it's interesting to me. I don't know, from an objectivist perspective, it doesn't seem like the politicians today are being very objective. They're kind of poking the bear for World War III so that they can say it's like a little sibling, you poke, poke, poke. And then when they punch back, they're going to be like, look, you started it. So it seems very unobjective. It doesn't seem that that's something that Rand would support, but it's really hard to say. I don't know if you could pull on it.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for her either, but if you just cite her and quote her on things from World War II to Vietnam and onward, and the whole Cold War, of course, she was alive during that whole point from 1905 to 1982. Lots of wars to discuss and comment on, which she did. But here's the bottom line. Her view was America's a great country. It's great because it's free. It's great because it has a constitutionally limited government. It's not an anarchy, so she was against the libertarian pacifism philosophy of foreign policy, but she was definitely not one of these imperialist John McCain interventionists running all over the world, making the world safe for democracy. That was Wilson. That was Woodrow Wilson. That was what got us into World War I. She was against us actually going into World War II, except against Japan, which attacked us. Now, it doesn't mean she endorsed Nazi Germany. At one point, she said, let the Nazis and the Soviets kill each other, and maybe we can finish off the winner. Instead, what did we do? We went in there and, well, I don't have to tell the story. She was very much against Vietnam. Why? Because she wanted the North Vietnamese to invade the South? Because she loved communism? Of course not. She didn't think it was in America's national self-interest. So there's Ayn Rand's egoism right there. Her view was, you have a right to self-defense. You should be egoistic in your personal life, but a nation, and a moral nation like America, should also be egoistic. They should not be sacrificing soldiers in foreign conflicts where there's no national U.S. interest. But you can see why philosophically she would say that could dominate both parties. Why? Because both parties tend to believe that altruistic self-sacrifice for others is moral. Mm-hmm. And when you bring that into foreign policy, you're going to put up with Vietnam, Afghanistan, all these failures. And at the end of the day, you're not going to really feel like it's a failure. You're going to feel like you were helping in a humanitarian way these poor victims. That's what's happening in Ukraine. That's what they're trying to gin up in regarding Taiwan. It's not a self-interested national foreign policy, which was Ayn Rand's approach, and mine.
I think that was a great synopsis. That's what I've taken from reading her. But I think we've seen recently people taking a few select quotes of hers and using that to justify, well, she would have said, just go in and wipe based on this one quote. And so I really like that synopsis, because I think that you're correct. And then so moving on now, finally, I think they talked a lot about foreign policy, and I heard Tucker Carlson last week say that they want to keep us focused on all these foreign issues because they don't want us putting our anger towards the real issues here at home, putting our anger towards our politicians. They want us channeling our anger abroad to issues that maybe aren't as important as they lead us to believe. So I don't know if that's true, but I sort of tend to agree with that. So finally, in the last 20 minutes of this debate, they decided to talk about the economy. And I know that this is in some ways a lot more interesting to you as an economist as well. So if we could go to Interestingly enough, Tim Scott, I wanted to get your thoughts on his answer. He talked about the economy in a more sophisticated way, but is he right? So we had this question: how can Americans make sure their pantry is stocked? So Lawrence, if we want to run how the economy question at 102.54.
Told NBC News, how am I going to make sure my pantry's stocked without breaking the bank? You've all said the best way to deal with rising prices is to cut government spending. But that would take time to play out, and Americans are struggling right now. Senator Scott, I'll start with you. What would you do the moment you take office to help Americans manage the cost of living? So we're talking about short term here.
My mother was a single mother who raised me and my brother in a very challenging economic situation. The first thing I can tell you is that when your gas prices are 40% higher right now than they were just a little over 2 years ago, that's not a problem for my mama. That was a crisis. The first thing I would do as President of the United States is I would sign the XL Keystone Pipeline and start seeing resources flow. Second thing I would do is make sure that there's certainty and predictability so that those folks who have the leases in our country would have the certainty and predictability to go ahead and become energy independent. We should focus not just on being energy independent, we should focus on being energy dominant. America is the home to more energy resources than any other country on the planet. We can reduce the price of energy, we can reduce the price of food and the price of electricity if we focus on my build here, don't borrow from China plan that is embedded. The Made in America strategy creates 10 million new jobs in 3 different areas. One is innovation. Second is the high-tech manufacturing. And the third is the energy economy. We have an opportunity as Americans to actually export the surplus energy that we create in our nation and disconnect from China and from murderous dictators and tyrants around the world.
Your time is up, but let me just follow up. The idea of pumping gas, of turning on pipelines, that doesn't make gas cheaper that day. I'm talking about you become president. What can you do specifically to help people feel better about their situation or be better with their situation?
Well, actually it does, to be honest with you. The way that the economy works is it works on the ability to anticipate excess supply versus the demand. When that happens, confidence drives our prices down because we know there's going to be a greater surplus. When you allow for those who have leases to actually start drilling, to start using those leases for more energy excavation, you put our economy in the strongest position. And as a result of that, prices start going down. That is the kind of economy that, as President of the United States, I would lead this nation to making sure that we first use the resources in our own country and not going outside of our country in order to achieve our objective. You know, Proverbs 22:7 reminds us.
I think that's a good stop right there.
Stop. Stop. I can't, my head is exploding. I can't stand it.
Yeah, so there's a lot there.
Here's a translation. Because the cost of living going up is inflation.
Yeah.
And that has caused the higher prices, higher currency prices, higher dollar prices. It's due to too many dollars. What is Tim Scott? Tim Scott's not talked, he hasn't even mentioned the dollar. Who issues dollars? The Federal Reserve. Why does the Federal Reserve print money? To help fund the government. Why does the government need funding? Because it doesn't have enough tax revenues and it's overspending. So it's deficit spending. It's borrowing money. He'd have to trace it all the way back to his seat in the Senate where he voted for all the spending. and his theory is inflation is caused by too little energy production. I mean, many on the stage said that. That is a standard, like, Democrat Keynesian textbook answer. Not the money supply, not the debasement of the dollar by the Federal Reserve, by the government's monopoly central bank. No, they never talk about any of that. I think DeSantis might have mentioned the Federal Reserve. Ramaswamy sometimes will say we need a new dollar policy where the dollar's value is stabilized, but he didn't say that, or he didn't even mention any of that tonight. So the problem with this one is, as you're listening to it as a Republican and as a pro-capitalist, I would say, yes, I want more energy production, but that is not the cause of inflation. Inflation is a broad-based increase in all prices, not just energy prices. So that was an answer to a question of, should we have more energy? And the answer should have been yes, we should have more energy and the government should stop
impeding energy production in the United States. But the question was cost of living. And also the question is so maniacal because Lester Holt kept saying, I want to know what you would do in the first minute. Now stop talking about a week later or a month later or a year later. I want action now. And of course, what he was looking for was executive order, I don't know, with price controls. I mean, if that was the answer, Lester Holt would have been very happy with that answer. Notice how short-term it is. He goes out of his way to say, I want a short-term fix. For what? For something that was basically a multi-year policy of COVID lockdowns, send everybody home, send them a check, print money, and voila, gee, I wonder why there's inflation. I wonder why prices are going up so much. The only solution is to stop deficit spending and stop printing money at the Fed. Now, fortunately, they've done that. They've curbed the rate of increase in the money supply since the COVID disaster. And so inflation peaked at what, like 10% or so? It was the highest since the Carter years, a couple of years back, but it's still running at something like 4 or 5%. No one answered it that way. No one basically said government money supply policy, government monetary policy has caused this inflation, and you got to put an end to that and shackle the Fed and stop letting the Fed print money without limit with this modern monetary theory that all you Democrats love, that you can somehow issue gobs of money without it having any effect on prices. So this was really a sad section because it had questioners who were so myopic, they wanted dictatorial executive order powers to cap prices. And yet no one on stage saying that's a false theory of inflation. Here's the right theory and here's what to do about it.
Do you think that part of the problem is that maybe not even Vivek or a single candidate on that stage really truly understands America's monetary policy? I think
DeSantis and Ramaswamy do. I think the challenge here is it's very difficult for them either to be motivated or to quickly, succinctly say what I just said, because it's one of the most complicated things in economics, monetary policy, money, inflation, where it comes from. The Federal Reserve has this theory, because it doesn't want to be blamed for causing the inflation, it is just solely responsible for it and helping a profligate Congress. But the Fed certainly doesn't want to say it's the cause of it. So what does the Fed say? Inflation is caused by the economy growing too fast and the unemployment rate's too low. So we need to slow down the economy. I mean, there's a theory that says we're producing too much. Rick Scott said we're not producing enough energy. The Fed's view is we're producing too much and the economy is overheating and we have to slow the economy with interest rate increases, if necessary, cause a recession. Right. That's how maniacal the Fed is. It's causing risk. None of the people on the stage said that. None of them said, not only did the government cause inflation, but the Fed is, quote, fighting the inflation by fighting prosperity. It's fighting the economy. It's putting us in a ditch. It's risking a recession next year. And so they caused the recession and the inflation. Now, I mean, see how far away they are from that answer. So they have these these little answers like, wow, gases are up at the pump. I guess we need more gas. It's less than a half truth. But
we can roll DeSantis and Vivek, at least the first part of Vivek's answer.
Okay.
We got so few opportunities to hear from them on the economy.
Right. I know.
The number one thing Americans consistently poll on is what they're most, worried about. But we got an hour and 5 minutes in before we got to hear about it. But let's roll at 1:07:17. We'll hear DeSantis followed by Vivek. Because you're right. They're getting
on
closer.
The cost of living. Okay.
Yeah, they're still very far away from where you were.
Yeah. Okay.
Bidenomics, I'm going to rip it up and I'm going to throw it in the trash can on day one where it belongs. That is going to give the economy breathing room. And I'm also going to rein in the Federal Reserve. They have helped create, with their reckless monetary policy, what we have faced since the COVID-19 pandemic. They botched it. Congress botched it. Both parties are to blame. Fed should focus on stable prices. They are not an economic central planner.
Good answer.
People.
Yeah.
Governor, thank you. Mr. Ramaswamy, weigh in on this. Ways that you can improve people's financial condition in the short term.
Right. And as a CEO, the economic question is core to my vision and policy prescription for this country. Increase the supply of everything. It's the law of supplies and demand. Increase the supply of energy. That brings down the cost of energy, grows the economy. Drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear. Increase the supply of labor in this country. Stop using our taxpayer money to pay people more to stay at home instead of to go to work. Increase the supply of housing. People don't talk about this one in the Republican Party. The land use restrictions are constricting the supply of housing. That's making housing more expensive for ordinary Americans across this country. So that's the true answer. And I think it takes a CEO in the White House who actually understands this to get this done. Because Americans at home, they know the Bidenomics is a lie. Prices are going up. Interest rates and mortgages to buy your home are going up. But wages have remained flat. That's the hard diagnosis for our economy. And this is about more than just our economy. I say this as a member of my generation. I'm 38 years old. I'm the youngest person ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. The reason my generation has lost our sense of national pride, in part, is because people in my generation feel like the American dream isn't available to them. And part of the reason why is we burdened them with four-year college degrees that did not serve their head start on the American dream. People will be more proud of a country if we're all making more money in that country. This is how we revive national pride and our identity, and it will take a CEO in the White House with zero-based budgeting, by the way, to take on the federal debt to get this job done.
Governor Chris.
Yeah, I found that last part as a young person, that's the kind of thing that riles you up. You're like, that's right, so.
Yeah, well, one of the problems with this answer is, again, if you want economic growth and prosperity, that's a good answer. But the question was, why is the cost of living going up and eating away at our real wages and income and lowering our standard of living? I mean, that's really what's happening, right? Now, notice what he said. At one point else in the debate, he said something like, we're growing, real output at something like 2%, and we could be growing at 5%. Okay, you cannot possibly outgrow in real terms, like literally widgets out of the assembly line, faster than the Fed prints money. The Fed increased the money supply 40% during COVID. Okay, you can't increase economic output 40%. So notice what their theory is. The problem is not the government is creating gobs of money at double-digit percentage rates. No, the problem is we need to increase the economic growth rate from 2 to 5. I'm all for increasing the growth rate from 2 to 5. 5 is the upper limit. It's really hard to get beyond that, right? But the real problem, obviously, is not the production of real goods. It's the production of money. And the production of money is out of control. And it happened under CEO Trump. So for Vivek also to say, you just need a CEO in there. We had a CEO in there, and it was Trump's Fed. It was Trump's appointed Fed. They're the ones who increased it 40%. The funny thing is, by the time Biden got in, the inflation was taking off because the money supply had already been increased. So funny enough, the conservatives blame Biden for the higher prices, but the higher prices came from the money supply boom caused by Trump. So that alone was kind of sweet justice and funny. But the idea of a CEO really knows how to keep the cost of living down is ridiculous. That's just not the way it works.
And I mean, I know from taking, macroeconomics and international political economy that, economics departments at universities are like, Keynesian economics is the end all be all. This is the only way to do it. I wonder if even your Republican candidates just don't think there's other options. We have to have a Fed that increases money supply. And I mean, do you think that's an issue? Or do you think
ignorance of it? Yes, I think it could be. I think you're onto something. I think this area is not only, it's almost like foreign policy, I hate to say it, where both sides are hawkish. On monetary policy, both sides have pretty much said, I guess we have to have a central bank, no gold standard, no handcuffs on this institution at all. Although notice DeSantis did say, I don't want them to be a central planning agency. Okay, great. But they're still central planners in monetary policy. They're still centrally planning the issuance of money. None of them talk about either restraining the Fed, let alone getting rid of the Fed. I'm not saying they have to get up there and say, end the Fed. But it worked actually when Ron Paul said it years ago, young people actually took to it. Now, you don't even have to go that far. They won't even say where the inflation is coming from. And if you at least identify the Fed, which only DeSantis did, but very much in passing, if you queried people afterwards to say, what was DeSantis's theory on the Fed and inflation, they couldn't tell you. But he did at least mention the institution that causes it. But nothing about, well, how would you stop it from doing that? And at the time, were you saying there should not be massive deficit spending associated with COVID because the Fed's only going to monetize it and we're going to get inflation? Almost none of these candidates said that at the time. They would have had a theory of, they would have had to have a theory of inflation that noticed that and predicted it, but they didn't. So I think you might be onto something, Abby. It isn't just an issue of, well, this is hard to explain in 13 seconds in a debate to explain monetary policy and inflation. It could also be because they just don't know. It's
Yeah.
not something they've been taught. Certainly not in the universities. The universities don't teach this anymore.
No. And then I think, so they didn't make Nikki Haley answer the same question, interestingly enough. I felt like they kind of threw her a nice softball question after this and asked her about rural households, which is, she's like, I'm from rural America. She got to
Right. Yeah.
play on
Yeah.
her on her path.
By the way, you notice that method comes up a lot, and Tim Scott uses that method and others use the method. It's kind of homey, and it's kind of, it's anecdotes, it's stories.
Yeah.
And I think they're trying to connect with voters. But from an analytic standpoint, you have to ask yourself, why would that give you, I'm a CEO, therefore I can fight inflation. Or,
Right.
I was born a poor Black child, therefore I know how to reform welfare. All those kind of methods are kind of, I don't know, they're cringeworthy to me because they're not convincing,
Yeah.
but I guess they tug at the heartstrings of people. This person's like me, or they've had experience, but it's not any way to say I should be president because I was born in certain circumstances. That just doesn't make sense.
It reminds me of, I took, a pre-law class, and the professor said that he'd help all of us get into law school. But the number one thing we had to do when we wrote our law school essays was talk about some hardship that we overcame. And he said, even if you have to make it up, you have to just drill in. That's what people care about, is your sob story. And he said, really make it a sob story. I'm telling you, that's how you're going to get into law school. And for some reason, it seems like a lot of people are very persuaded by the sob story. But I agree. To me, it's cringeworthy. I think to a lot of young people or people who've been watching politics for a long time, maybe it just comes off as so disingenuous. Mitt Romney and the on my eating off the ironing board.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Like,
Right. You have to do that in a democracy when most of the voters are not that focused or that interested. You need these homey kind of examples to connect, but they're all up there mostly. They're all multimillionaires, and by now, which is nothing against multimillionaires, but they know they're having a hard time connect. By the way, the last thing that came up here, just in case we have some minutes for it, is Social Security. It was interesting. It was interesting to me that NBC even mentioned it, but I think in a case like NBC, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get these people on record for, throwing Granny under the bus and cutting her benefits. But none of them took on the idea. What?
None of them took the bait and threw Granny.
Right. None of them did take the debate. The debate. All of them did say, "Gonna protect Granny, not gonna touch Granny. Wouldn't be prudent." That's my George Bush imitation. But I've written on this before. I realize this cannot be the radical answer they would give, but there is a way to phase out Social Security safely without screwing over older people who count on the checks. And some of them did mention that something has to be done that gives younger people the freedom to kind of opt out of the system and not have their wages docked, in the beginning, and let them set aside. There was the mention of that, but the last time this was, I forget who did it, maybe Haley, someone. But the bottom line on this is whether it was Medicare, Medicaid, any kind of part about the welfare state, redistribution of state, it seems like the Republican Party has totally given up on any attempt to restrain or phase out the welfare state. And that's bigger even than defense spending or military spending. It's the thing that's bankrupting us. It's the thing that ultimately leads to deficit spending and inflation. So they could have tied it in that way. But so that question and exchange, I think, was largely fruitless, other than telling us that none of these top candidates, by the way, including Trump said, Social Security, not even going to talk about it. Medicare, not even going to talk about it. Medicaid. But those three programs alone are probably 2/3 of the reason there is chronic deficit spending now. So everybody talks about the national debt, going up to 35 trillion. But if you say to them, do you realize that 2/3 of the reason, it's not just your forever wars that you lose, that part of the reason is this huge redistributionist welfare state. What are you going to do about that? They would never go there. So they're mentioning the consequences of this fiscal profligacy, the debt. But that's the end consequence. Like if I said, hey, Abby, your credit card balance is, up to 32,000, and you don't look into, well, why are you excess spending every week, and on what, and why, and is it wasteful or not? Well, you can't just cite the credit card balance out of context.
Yeah. I get kind of frustrated, I have to say, and I think a lot of young people do, with Republican voters on this, because it's one of those things where they show bias. They're not being objective when they continue to, the Republican candidates that I vote for cannot support ending Social Security because I need Social Security now for my retirement. And frustrating because young people like me are paying into it. We're never going to
Yes.
see it. We know
Right.
it's not solvent, hasn't been solvent since
Right.
Clinton was in office, pretty sure. So
Right.
it's this thing where I feel like Republican candidates are scared, and maybe their PR teams are like, whatever you do not mention, Grant, don't come for Granny. Like, you can't.
Yeah.
So it seems like they're just running, as far as the ways they can from
There
this.
there was a Republican primary. I'm trying to think how many years ago it was, but it was Rick Perry, governor of Texas, and he said, controversially, Social Security is a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
And he got unholy hell for it. And at the time, I wrote an essay for Forbes saying, it is a Ponzi scheme. You're courageous to say it, and here's how to phase it out safely. Safely and fairly. But safely by that, I mean, you're not going to bankrupt a bunch of people. And then fairly and justly on the grounds of you've already promised older people. But again, I said in the beginning, don't judge candidates on, being far away from our ideal. My ideal would be to have no government involved in Social Security at all. But I have a chapter in my book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone?, which shows step by step how to dismantle Social Security safely. And now here's the thing electorally why it's very interesting. You'd get all the youth vote, because step one in the plan is you stop taxing young workers, up to like 25 years old, 30 years old. You stop taking out Social Security from their paycheck. Or if they pay it, you put it in a bank account that they have. You don't just transfer it over to Granny. Now, that does mean the current recipients will fall short. And I just said that the government should basically borrow and pay Granny right away. And, people might say, well, that's just increasing the national debt. It's already a debt. It's already a promise to the elderly. And when you think that when I proposed that, the national debt was something like 18 trillion. And my plan would have increased the national debt like to 23. To get rid of Social Security would have been a one-shot borrow to pay the elderly, give them IRA accounts that they controlled, and stop taxing young people. That FICA line that comes out of your paycheck would disappear. The youth of this country would vote for Republicans the minute a Republican said that. But we're getting into technical aspects. But there could have been a much better answer on Social Security. They're clearly not willing to challenge or think more innovatively about how to do that.
Right. And I think Social Security, aside from being a Ponzi scheme, it was this incredibly anti-American, paternalistic idea. Well, you're not going to probably do well enough to save for yourself. You're not responsible enough to save for retirement for yourself.
Right.
So let the government do it for you. And it's just, it seems, from a young person's perspective, it's like, well, you bought into that, now, that was totally just a scam to get your money.
And it was instituted in the middle of the Great Depression. So part of it was the elderly were losing their stock portfolio and their house price values and everything like that. So pensions and retirement, even though retirement was very brief in the 30s, because lifespans were still like in the low 60s. So very few people had long retirements. Now they have 15, 16, 17-year retirements. So that was the plausibility of doing it then. But the payroll tax when it started was 3%. Now it's 16%. And in Europe, the older Social Security systems, guess what the payroll tax is? 30. They take 1/3 of your paycheck in Germany and elsewhere to put it into, quote, Social Security. And of course, over the time, Congress raided the trust fund. So there isn't any money in the fund at all. When someone like Abby pays her Social Security taxes, it goes right to an elderly person today, somewhere else in the country that she doesn't even know. And it doesn't build up and earn assets. They're not invested in anything. And that's why this thing is a perpetual Ponzi scheme, because there's no money there. It's been spent. So, but again, you can dismantle this just as you can dismantle the Federal Reserve safely, quickly, and justly. So that the plans are out there. I'm not expecting these candidates to say that, but here they're just traditionally and conventionally just endorsing the existing welfare state. And the disconnect is they'll cite the consequences. Like, wow, our national debt's 35 trillion. That's terrible. Nikki Haley at one point said we need to repay the debt. You know what repay the debt means? That means take it from 35 trillion to zero.
Right.
You can't repay the debt unless you completely dismantle the government. So see, nobody even knows the math of this.
Well, Vivek does say,
to ask a follow-up question.
Cuts in federal agencies, shut down the resiliency, then foreign wars. He's the only one, and then everybody's like, "That's crazy! You can't do that." So I don't know how Nikki Haley is going to repay the debt. I don't even think if Vivek did all that, it would repay the debt. But I know
someone did cite the fact that interest expense on the national debt. Again, getting into the weeds here, right? That is a budget. That is a budget item, and people are like, "Wait a minute! The interest on the national debt itself." By the way, I calculated in 5 years. The interest expense on paying this debt because interest rates went up and the debt went up, will exceed spending on military. One of the proper functions of government is the military, not an unlimited military that's roving all over the world losing wars, but military is a legitimate government function. Can you imagine getting to the state where you're so profligate, you're so spending beyond your means that the interest expense alone, we know this on credit cards, right? If your credit card interest rate is 18%, at some point you're borrowing so much that the interest expense is eating up your income and you're stuck. You're in like a debt trap. You can't get out of it. It gets added to the balance. You see the point personally. That can happen to a country as well. And it's happening to the US because these candidates, not just the Republicans, the Democrats, are not willing to challenge the core elements of the welfare state, the transfer, what I call the transfer state, which is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Yeah. And Ron DeSantis even mentions at one point increasing Medicare. So like, we're going to get rid of Social Security. We're going to like increase it. Like, he's like, and there's a lot of people on Social Security in my state, and I know they'll love that. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make it a good policy. I get you're from Florida and
that's the Democrat solution. Medicare for all, Bernie Sanders called it. Now, Medicare for all. So Medicare for what is it now? The elderly. So the elderly are what? I don't know, 25% of the population. To say Medicare for all is another way of saying total socialized medicine coast to coast. That's the Democrat view. The Republican view is maybe against that, or to do it in slow motion. Instead of dismantling and phasing out safely and fairly the existing government involvement in healthcare, the Republicans are kind of want to freeze it in place, and the Democrats want to extend it from 25% of the population to 100%.
Right. Well, we got, that was then they kind of ended the conversations on economics. They went back to talking about the border. I know we're kind of running short on time here, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to end with, any kind of last takeaways you had from the debate overall, if your opinions shifted on any of the candidates throughout the debate, or.
Well, I'm glad it's being winnowed down. I hope the next one is just Haley, DeSantis, and Ramaswamy. So I think the quality is getting better. I think this panel, actually, even though they were Democrats and NBC, was better than the Fox panel. I remember Ramaswamy said this panel should be a bunch of Republicans, including Tucker, questioning us. But we saw that when Fox did it, the Fox questions were terrible. And there was a lot of, crosstalk going on. So this was a better debate. I hope the future ones will be as well. What I think we have to keep in mind here is the intention on the other side to get Trump in jail and to bankrupt his entire enterprises and to get his kids in jail. I'm looking at that on the side, thinking that is possible. And that makes these people on stage more important. And I think if you asked DeSantis and others, they wouldn't say this because it's too brazen and too obvious. But if you ask them in private, they would probably say something like, this is worth doing, not only as a practice run for 2028, but because it's perfectly possible that we'll wake up one morning and Donald Trump is not in the race.
Right.
He might be in the race, but he's going to be in jail or he's going to be so caught up in court, and they're waiting for that. I don't mean like they're vultures, waiting for that. I don't think they want that to be the case, but I think that is more possible than people realize. So when they dismiss these debates as who cares, Trump is the leader in the polls. For now, notice all they're saying is it isn't obvious that he could beat Biden. But Biden is deteriorating so badly and losing such support among Democrats that now the view is, it goes back to, well, Trump maybe could beat Biden.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that lessens the importance of these debates in the minds of people. I think the debates are important, one, to track how this party's moving, in what direction they're moving, what the younger ones look like and sound like. And I think the future is basically DeSantis versus Newsom, Florida versus California, the free state versus the crazy green tyrannical state. Whether those are the actual two guys, they're the youngest, most vibrant, most prominent, and they run big states and they're governors. So whatever happens over the next 4 years or so, I think the future is DeSantis versus Newsom.
And I think that's a good time to bring up that on December 1st, so the day after Newsom is going to debate DeSantis, which I think will be very interesting. We're going to get a Democrat versus a Republican for the first. We are going to do one of these breakdowns of that DeSantis and Newsom debate. So we'll be releasing that on our website and in our newsletter with, everybody can register for that. We're putting it up on our YouTube. And last question was, in terms of Trump, I wanted to ask you this. Do you think that this most recent civil case is the best bet that the Democrats and whoever's, going after him has to get to him? Do you think this one actually has a shot?
No, I think the more dangerous case for him is the January 6th stuff. I can't keep one of them is Georgia, questioning the Georgia results. The other one is obviously New York and the business. But I think the one they're trying to do that would go to the Constitution, which says you can't run if you're part of an insurrection. The reason they've been calling it an insurrection all these years is not because it was one. It's because that's the word in the Constitution that says if you're part of this, and that was referring to, by the way, the Confederacy.
Yeah,
right. Then you're not eligible to run for president. So they fixated on that, and they're trying to get him for that, and that would exclude him. Now, whether it would jail him or not, I don't know. I forget. But the business thing is they're just trying to bankrupt him.
Right. They're just trying to.
He's totally self-funded, right? He did part of Trump's successful pitch in 2016 was, I'm self-funding this. I'm not relying on funding from others, and therefore I'm not a puppet of the donor class, right? Well, so the opponents of Trump's view is, good, then let's bankrupt him. Let's have him, take away his businesses, make it impossible for him to hold these businesses, and so that's what the case in New York is. The claim that he somehow defrauded these smart, sharp-elbowed New York bankers. He's supposedly defrauded by paying every cent back that he ever borrowed from them. It's a ludicrous case, but the key is also whether he gets jail time. I mean, that not only tarnishes the image of the person, makes it much more difficult for them to run for president, but I think it's a definite, all four of these cases are a definite case of prosecutorial abuse. Yeah. And it's Banana Republic type stuff. It really is very autocratic and awful for the Biden regime to be doing this. And it's largely the Biden regime doing this. I call it a regime. I don't call them administrations anymore, because these are regimes and these are more authoritarian, not just Biden, but I think Obama, and in a certain sense, Trump in COVID, the idea of locking down and shutting down the economy. There's really some disturbing authoritarian elements creeping into American presidencies from both parties. So, but your question was, will Trump survive this? I think the more dangerous one is the insurrection charge of January 6th, which I don't know when that trial begins. But from right now, they're just trying to take away his businesses and shut down the whole Trump commercial empire.
Right. And with dragging his kids into it, which is interesting to me, because at the same time that they're doing this to Trump and his kids, you can get online and you can read, text messages and documents between Biden and his sons talking about millions of dollars in meetings with Chinese diplomats and Ukrainian diplomats. And you can see it happening with the current sitting president to absolute crickets.
Yeah, and I've long said about Trump, and I lived and worked in New York for many years when he was there as well. I actually met him once at a book signing and gave him the Fountainhead. I gave him a copy of the Fountainhead and congratulated him on his book. That was like in 1987 when The Art of the Deal came out. But one thing about his career in New York I noticed, and is still true today, you know how difficult it is to be a real estate guy dealing with unions and cement companies and contractors in New York City with the mob and everything else, and come out clean. He is the most investigated president and presidential candidate ever. And the fact that he's never been found to have done anything criminal is really amazing, especially because he's in an industry where that's highly likely that some of that bad stuff would involve him. And so that alone tells me that is not Trump's weaknesses, and all the more reason why I think it's very unjust and arbitrary for them to be using what's called lawfare, to be using the legal system as warfare against a viable presidential candidate. It's not because the guy is corrupt in his business practices. That's just nonsense. Is he an exaggerator of his net worth and other things about? Of course he is. But he was working with other New York bankers who are the sharpest in the world. They're not going to be taken in by Trump, and they weren't. So this is really a political vendetta against Trump, literally trying to wipe him off the ballots because they don't think they can beat him. It's terrible.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess we'll see. So we'll do the Newsom and DeSantis debate. And then
looking forward to it.
For the next GOP debate, if Trump is maybe going to make an entrance. I doubt he will until it's down to maybe just Haley and DeSantis. I don't know. I think he likes Vivek. I think they might be friends behind the scenes. That's my latest my latest conspiracy.
The other interesting development, other than the Republicans doing badly in the off-year elections the other night, the governor of Iowa did endorse DeSantis. And of course, the Iowa caucuses are first. So a governor endorsing DeSantis, that was a big thing.
Yeah.
So we'll see whether more of that happens. But that was an interesting development as well, I thought.
Yeah, and I think it's bold of DeSantis to do this debate with Newsom because he's not, he's really not as good as everybody could have hoped on stage. And I think Newsom is very charismatic. So it'll be interesting to see if he performs well. I think that'll look very good for him. If he performs really poorly, gets up there and just gets his butt handed to him by Newsom, that's going to look really bad for his campaign. So
yeah, the other thing you'll notice is even if Newsom does well, it'll be so obvious to Democrats who will definitely watch that, right? They'll watch that in a way, the Democrats will, in a way they would not watch, say, the Republican primary debates. But the other thing that will be obvious is if Newsom performs as I expect him to do, they'll look at this and they'll say, there's no way Biden could have done this.
Right.
There's no way Biden could have been there for an hour, without a change of diapers or anything like that, and talk with DeSantis and go back and forth the way Newsom just did. So then that alone will tell Democrats, oh my gosh, we have a problem if we stay with Biden.
Yeah, I saw some of Biden's first campaign ads today and they were just sad. I mean, it was sad. They were so slow and he looked like he was going to fall asleep in the middle of his own campaign ad. So something's going to have to be done. But
I think it also could be Trump's attitude is this, and Biden certainly doesn't want to participate. If it were true that it was Biden-Trump, which I think is unlikely, but suppose it's true, I think it could be the first cycle since the Kennedy-Nixon debates where there's no debates.
Yeah,
I think it's perfectly possible that if it's Trump versus Biden, neither of them will debate each other, and they'll both have their own motives not to do so, and that'll be a break with tradition.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. Biden will say, I'm above, debating with a man like him. I wouldn't lower myself. Yeah, lower yourself.
And Trump will say, I don't agree with the panel because they're all, NBCers or whatever.
Yeah, fake news media.
But you can see why, even though the media relishes these kind of things, the media doesn't want Biden debating. So they're going to be torn on this. On the one hand, they want the eyeballs. On the other hand, they don't want Biden to look like an idiot, which he would against Trump. So that'll be an interesting clash. So thank you for doing this, Abby.
Yeah,
I look forward to joining
us. And you guys can catch this on YouTube. We'll have some shorter snippets from it. We'll have the full length version here in the next day or so. So we will see you all next time. Friday, December 1st. We'll release all the information very soon.
See you all then. Thank you so much. Thanks, Abby.